You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbgive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by bbbgive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator and your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor, your host. And with me today is someone who makes true the adage, it's not where you start that matters, it's where you end up. Our guest, Sam Cobbs, who is the president and CEO of Tipping Point Community, a San Francisco Bay Area foundation that provides unrestricted grant funding to help nonprofit organizations working in the Bay Area to alleviate poverty. Sam Cobbs started out in very humble beginnings himself, and now he is leading the way to not only improving the conditions of people in the Bay Area who are struggling in poverty, but he's also charting a new path for philanthropic organizations generally. And we're going to get to talk to Sam in a two-part interview. This is part one, where we'll discuss his early life and what led him to Tipping Point, including some of his previous stops in organizations working on the ground, and then get into his philanthropic philosophy in our second episode. Well, Sam, welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast.
Well, thanks for having me today. I'm looking forward to being in a conversation with you.
Sam, I'm really interested in your background, which is quite amazing. You've been someone who has done charity on the ground, for many years, and now find yourself in the somewhat enviable position in our sector of being a grant maker. And I hope we can cover all of that. But I also would like to talk with you about how this all began. For you, growing up in Mississippi, I believe you stated in a piece that I read recently that you learned a lot from your father, who was giving a lot back to the community.
Yeah, so definitely. And thanks again, Art. My understanding how important it was to give back to the community really did come from my father and my family. And so to give a little bit of context, I was born and raised in the Mississippi Delta. And I like to say that Mississippi is considered as the poorest state, and the Delta is the poorest part of Mississippi. And so that is where I was born and raised. And my father had the luck and the opportunity to be a high school football star, and therefore he was able to go to college. But he was one of the first African-American businessmen in our little small town of Indianola, Mississippi. And I saw the way that he gave back. And I often say that the first reentry program that I ever saw was my father ran it. And it wasn't that he was intending to do reentry. It was just that the people that he hired, he was a roofer, and the people that he hired usually had been in jail or in prison and were coming back to their community. I also saw him as the first Parks and Rec director that I ever saw, and mainly because he had the only ladder that was tall enough to change the nets on the basketball hoop on what we call the black side of town. And so we had a black side of town and a white side of town where I grew up, with a railroad track that ran down the middle. And then finally, he was also ran the first mentor or big brother, big sister program, because he was also the Boy Scout troop leader. And I asked him one day, I said, Dad, why every time we go somewhere, we have people with us? We have other boys with us. And what he told me was like, they are not in the same situation that you're in, where they have someone who is taking interest in what it is that they're doing. And so I am going to be that person. And so he was really proud And he always called them his boys, and his boys always looked at that time with fondness. And so now they are doctors and lawyers and the head of the physics department at Howard University. And all of them came from his Boy Scout troop. And so I saw the way that he gave back to his community. And that was something that I didn't know it at the time, Art, but was being instilled in me. And this whole feeling that whom much is given, you have the responsibility to also give much to others. And so that's where the idea of giving back to community came from for me.
Your father's influence is apparent in how you've spent your career. You've had, it seems, almost every job working at the grassroots level, helping people make something of their lives. It looks like at one point you were with the Boys and Girls Clubs. What was your experience like there? And how did you end up there?
That's correct. The way I ended up at the Boys and Girls Club. And so one of the things that I talk a lot about, Art, is that how lucky I have been in my life and in my career. And so one of the things that we have to do, and we can get into this a little bit later, but how do we in philanthropy or we in social services, how do we take luck out of the equation? And so what happened in the way I ended up at the Boys and Girls Club is that I was working for a construction company, a roofing company, and they no longer needed me. The last job that I worked on was at a Parks and Rec facility, and my role was I was customer service. I had to go out there and make sure that everyone on the project, that the owners of the project felt good about how the project and how the roof was going. And when I didn't show up one day, the lady who ran Parks and Rec for Richmond, California, called and she wondered where I was. And when she found out that I was no longer with the company, she offered me a job working with kids. And based on how I had treated her and how I'd done my job for the construction company. And so that was the first time really that I ever had a job that I absolutely loved. And part of that was because for the first time, I saw kids that had to worry about things that I never had to worry about growing up, right? It was the first time that I hear people talk about going to a foreign country and coming back and being able to feel blessed about what it is that they have and where they've been. I didn't have to go to a foreign country. I just had to experience Richmond, California. And so these kids were worried about things that I never had to worry about. And for the first time, I felt really blessed and privileged based on what it was, my upbringing and how I was brought up. And so I started the job. It was just a summer job in Richmond. And one day they had a guest speaker coming in from Portland, Oregon. And they asked me if I would go and pick her up from the airport. And so I went and picked her up. I still remember her name. Her name is Linda. And I picked Linda up. And as we're driving back for me to drop her off at her hotel, she starts to talk to me and ask me questions about who I am, where I come from, why am I doing this work? And then she says, Sam, you should be working for the Boys and Girls Club, not Parks and Rec. And I said, that sounds great. She said, Sam, I am opening up a new club in Portland, Oregon. And I would love if you would come to work for me there. And she said, your starting salary would be about $24,000 a year. I was like, $24,000 a year? Like, I'm rich.
Wow.
Of course I'll do that. And so I applied for the job, went through the interviews, and she was calling, I thought, to offer me the job. But then she said, Sam, I noticed on your resume that you don't have a college degree. And I said, no, I don't have a college degree, Lynn. And she said, well, in order to do this work, you need a college degree. And I'm sorry, but I can't offer you this job. But I will connect you with my friend at the Boys and Girls Club there in Oakland. And so that did two things for me, Art. For the first time ever in my life, education became relevant. That this was the first time that there was something that I really wanted that I couldn't have because I didn't have that piece of paper. I didn't have that education, right? The other thing that it did for me is that it did connect me to the Boys and Girls Club. And I remember calling Mr. Cal Stanley. I would call him every Monday for 6 months. And I eventually wore him down until he passed me on to a lady by the name of Carolyn Bolton, and she eventually hired me. And so that's how I ended up. And so it was, if I wasn't the person who had time, if I wasn't the person who they felt comfortable with going to pick up the guest speaker and that I would get her back safely to where it was that she was going to go, that connection would have never happened for me. And so there's the idea of luck in coming into the opportunity. But through my upbringing in Mississippi and working with my father and seeing things, I was also prepared for how to handle that when that opportunity came my way.
So how did you manage the whole education thing?
So the way that I manage education is I talk to people. You say early on, you said, Sam, you started from the grassroots level. You worked at these things. I often tell people I had to get 2 promotions before I was a case manager. Usually a case manager is in most nonprofit organizations, it's kind of low man on the totem pole. I had to get 2 promotions. And so I worked at the Boys and Girls Club Tuesday through Saturday. I eventually became full-time there. When they originally hired me, they needed me for 15 hours a week. I probably worked closer to 35 or 40. They could only afford to pay me for 12 hours a week. And I promise you the last 3 hours, they gave it to me in quarters from the video game machine.
Wow.
And so I worked at the Boys and Girls Club from 1 o'clock until 9 o'clock. And then I went to school every day from 8 o'clock to 12 o'clock. And I was lucky enough to have someone, my manager at the Boys and Girls Club, a lady by the name of Carolyn Bolton. She understood what it was that I was going through. And she supported me tenaciously, like she was, and I call her now my second mother, right? She was what my father was in California, what he was for some of the boys in Mississippi. And I remember I would sit there, Art. I started at community college and then transferred into a state college. And I remember the first year, the way that financial aid worked was that they didn't give you your financial aid refund. They didn't give you your check until you had been in school for about 6 weeks, because they wanted to make sure that you weren't going to get that $8 and then disappear. But understood what it was that they were trying to do. But at the same time, if you were a person like me, you were in class for 6 weeks without a book. And not only does that diminish what it is that you can learn, but for me, it was very embarrassing. And so if I wasn't a little bit older, if I hadn't have been through some of the things that I'd gone through, I would have quit. But instead, I faked the funk like I had a book, an old edition from the library that looked close to the book that we had. And I sat there and I took meticulous notes. And Carolyn realized that. And at some point, she began to loan me money at the beginning of every semester so that I could get my books and that I would pay her back when I got my financial aid check, when I got my refund. And that's how I managed the work piece. And I was able to do it because I had someone who was in my life looking out for me that was unbelievably supportive of what it was that I was trying to achieve.
That's amazing. I had Dan Porterfield on recently, who's now head of the Aspen Institute. And Dan is right at the center of the whole college access movement, where he's working with many others, including people at Bloomberg Philanthropies, to create better pathways for people who were in your situation, frankly, who many cases don't even apply to college because they can't work it out, in the way that you did. They can't see themselves managing it. And they're talented, they're able to do the work, but they don't even apply in many cases to college. And here, you're a clear example of someone who fought through it and with help of someone else was able to do it. So it's great that there are these other folk out there now trying to do this on a much larger scale, and colleges are much more aware of this than they used to be. Sam, you mentioned that you were working for almost probably barely minimum wage in this job that you had at the Boys and Girls Club. And I'm just curious what you think today about people having to make that kind of sacrifice to serve our society and to serve people, in your case, young people?
It is really it's tough for people to make that sacrifice, right? To forego what could be a much more lucrative career, to say, I want to serve, I want to be able to give back to my community. And it's a lot tougher now, Art, than it was for me then, right? And so I just think about the American dream of owning your own home. And so when I bought my first house, I had to move way outside of Oakland and San Francisco to a place called Pittsburgh, California. And I was able to find a house in Pittsburgh. And for some of your listeners who live in other parts of the country, this may still sound crazy, but I was able to find a house out the door for $100,000. It needed some work. And because my family was in construction, we had some sweat equity in it. But the sad thing for me is that when I sold that house, it's great for me. When I sold that house and bought another house 5 years later, that house that cost me $100,000 I was able to sell it for over $300,000. And the sad thing to me was that I knew that I had staff people who were making what I made then. And if this was the last place in the Bay Area that I could afford, that they weren't going to be able to even afford moving all the way out here. It wears on me that the quality of life of people who are taking care of our most vulnerable, helping people become better themselves. And so even, we have an issue of pensions within California, and we pay a lot toward pensions. But at the same time, these are people who have forgone much more lucrative careers in corporate America and other places because they have that desire to make their community a much better community. And they take a huge hit. They take a huge sacrifice. Now, at the same time, I also believe that because I have done that and because people do that there are opportunities and blessings that find them and that come their way that don't necessarily find other people and come their way. And so that money isn't everything. It is a necessary condition. But there are opportunities that I think have come my way that I've been able to take advantage of. And I really believe that that is because I have dedicated my life to really helping people become the best version of themselves that they can be.
Yeah, that's important to know, because I think some people look at this field that we're in and they say, I can't sacrifice like that. And yet there are rewards, whether it's monetary or as you say, unexpected blessings that come along with the work. It's there. I could probably point to many situations myself where things happen for me that I would never have thought would have happened simply because I did a particular thing for someone else. And good news seems to find us, I think. But there is a sacrifice. And I wonder if there's something that our sector could do differently. I don't know if you've given it any thought, but it may tie into what we're going to talk about a little bit later, which is how funders think about supporting organizations and the people in those organizations. Maybe it'll connect with that. But I also think that it troubles me sometimes, Sam, when I listen to people who want to support organizations put certain kinds of financial restrictions on organizations who frankly need those resources to just give people a decent living so that they can go about doing the work.
You're exactly right, Art. When we put certain restrictions on funding, and so I'm now at the tipping point community where all of our grants that we give to organizations are unrestricted. And organizations can use the dollars wherever and however they see best fit, not us telling them that they need to spend it on a particular project. But when we start to think about the living wage and what it is that people are making, we have to understand what is the quality of life that people are living, again, who are taking care of our most vulnerable. And so I'll give you an example of things that I didn't understand when I was running a different organization. And so I prided myself on saying that my staff were in the top 80 percentile of all nonprofit workers or employees in the Bay Area. And it took a very savvy HR perspective person to come in and say, Sam, it's great that our staff are in the 80th percentile of the nonprofit sector. But even if we were in the 100th percentile, they still can't make ends meet. Right? Like, so don't be bragging and don't feel good that you're in the 80th percentile, because even if we were 100 percentile, they couldn't make ends meet. They couldn't take care of themselves. They still may need some level of government assistance somewhere just to make it happen. And so that taught me something, Art. That taught me that I needed to understand what was the real cost of living and what was it that I had the ability to pay the staff that were working with me. And if I wanted the best, that I needed to do better, because I also believe that the people that I was working with deserved the best. They didn't deserve the cast off for those that couldn't work anywhere else and they're working here because they can't find a job somewhere else. These were people who had dedicated their lives. And so we have to be able to make sure that we're treating people fairly, that we're paying more than a living wage. We don't want people to just make ends meet. We want people to be able to prosper. And you can think about it in the way that when we could fly, right, when we were still flying and we weren't in a pandemic, you got on the plane and they said, well, if you got a small kid with you or someone who can't handle this, and the altitude changes and the mask drops down and you need oxygen, to put it on yourself first and then help the person that needs help. And the reason they do that is, you love your kids, but if you put it on your kid first, your kid can't help you put it on. And so there you are struggling to breathe. And the same thing, the same analogy goes toward our nonprofit and social sector workers, that if they are stressing out, if they can't make ends meet, if they are having trouble figuring out how they're going to do this, they're really no good to the other people that they're trying to help. And so how do we alleviate that? How do funders actually think about that? And this whole idea of like, oh, we don't want to spend this much money on administrative and we don't want to do that. That's just like going to the restaurant and say, I want to pay for the food, but I don't want to pay anybody down the supply chain that picked it. I don't want to take the cost out of the people who are serving it to me. I just want to pay for the raw ingredient. I just want to pay for the seeds. And so that would not work in the restaurant industry, and it should not work in the nonprofit industry.
So what would you say to people contemplating entering our field that might inspire them to take that step, even though there are these challenges?
What I would say to people who are contemplating being a part of service, and that is whether that is the nonprofit service or the government service, that there are some things that you cannot value monetarily. And so there are some things, like I got a call about a year ago from the old director at the Boys and Girls Club, ED. And he was at a benefit and he was sitting by this gentleman, Dr. Charles Cole. And they called me from the table. I hadn't talked to Cal in a while. And he said, Sam, I am sitting here next to Dr. Charles Cole. And Dr. Cole just told me that he was a member of the club and that you saved his life. And because he said he saw you and what it was that you were doing, and that prevented him from going down a horrible path. And I must admit, I didn't remember Charles. I didn't remember who he was. I went on LinkedIn, I looked at his picture, and and then I finally found one with a smile, and I remembered the smile. And after a while, I remembered, I was like, the reason I don't remember him, because he said he was a bad kid or that he was into a whole lot of trouble, but I don't remember him getting into any trouble. Right? And so you usually remember the young people who make you work the hardest, you remember their names. But what I realized was that Charles, on some level, was watching me quietly. He wasn't watching what it was that I said. He was watching what it was that I did. And to receive that call that he is now a doctor. He has given his life to improving the education system and how we can make it much more equitable and reach kids who were like him. And so that is one of the greatest rewards that you could ever get, to understand that you have impacted someone at a level that they are now using their life to impact others. And so if that's what it is, we want our society to get better. If that's what it is that we want to do, we need more people to give their lives to service and to be of service to others.
Well, you certainly had the opportunity to impact many lives, and I am drawn to the work you did helping young people who were coming out of the foster system. And I'm really interested, Sam, to know how that work affected you and what you think you were able to accomplish really for folk who were at that stage in their lives.
Yeah, so the working with young people who were transitioning out of the foster care system, the first thing that it taught me in the way that it impacted me was kids who were transitioning out of foster care. They really taught me the true meaning of love, or what it was to love and what it was to forgive, because these were young people who had been taken away and sometimes for really good reasons from their parents, have been dealt just a horrible deck. And that they had every reason, if anybody had a reason to be bitter, these were young people who had reasons to be bitter, right? To feel like society owed them something. But yet, they were some of the most optimistic young people that I had ever met. And so they taught me how to forgive and the true meaning of love. And I remember going to, I'd worked with kids for a long time, and, we would do these talent shows. And if I worked at the Boys and Girls Club, I would have to get on kids about heckling the other kids who were on stage at the talent shows. But when we would do talent shows with our foster kids, they never put other kids down, right? They encouraged them. They continued to encourage them, regardless of how good or how bad they were, because to them, they were brothers and sisters. And so that it had a tremendous impact on me from just a personal perspective, and watching how they went about their lives. And yes, they had some difficulties, but it was amazing their capacity to love and to encourage others despite what it was that they were going through themselves. And I think we were able to have, on the actual foster care system and the individual lives, we were able to have a tremendous amount of impact. And one of the reasons we were able to have that impact is very early on, I happened to meet Daniel Lurie, who's the founder of the organization that I now run. And Tipping Point was just getting started, and I just started at First Place for Youth. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure of, Art, was that if young people who were transitioning from foster care were going to entrust their lives to us, that we needed to do better than just kick the can down the road. That I needed to understand, not just we, but that I needed to understand that if I was working with young people and I was going to go out and seek funding and go through all of the things that I needed to go through to get funding to support these young people, that they were far better off than having come in contact with us than they would be if they had continued to walk by. And so I needed to understand that for myself, because 90% of the kids that I was working with looked like me and came from the same types of communities that I came from. And so regardless of the funding, I needed to make sure that we were being successful and that we were making a difference in these young people's lives. And so it started with making a difference in the young people's lives, the individual young people. But then we quickly moved to, how do we change the system that actually creates and sustains the problem that we're trying to solve? And that I wanted to have an impact on young people who were in foster care in places that I would probably never go to or visit. And so that's what I mean by systematic change. And so I think we First Place for Youth had and continues to have not only an impact on individual young people's lives, but the foster care system as a whole, as we were able to grow that organization from being a grassroots. I had 17 employees, a budget of about 1.2 million. We were serving about 300 kids when I arrived. When I left, and they've grown since I left, we were at $30 million budget. We had a staff of over 150 serving young people throughout the United States and really working with about 5,000 young people every year.
Fantastic. If you had President Biden here right now, what would you share with him about what we could do better to support those young people?
What would I would share with President Biden is that we have to take a two-generation approach, right? That in order to help young people, you also have to make sure that the parents of these young people are okay, that they are taken care of, as well. And so when you think about my work in the foster care system, what I learned over the years is that foster care was a manifestation of poverty. It wasn't that parents couldn't or didn't want to take care of their kids. It was just that they didn't have the means to do so. That created other issues. And so I love some of the proposals in the Build Back Better plan and in the infrastructure plan of how we're going to cut child poverty and how we're going to increase investment in families, right? And so I would applaud him for that. What I would also tell him is that giving people the opportunity to go to college for free is just the first step. It is really what it is. You mentioned college access and what that looks like. It really is what happens once people and the support that they get while they're in college, because going to college, if you don't finish, that just creates bigger bills and more barriers for you down the line. Right. That is not about going to college. It's about finishing college. And so what are we going to do steps along the way to help make sure that people finish college? And sometimes when people aren't finishing college, it is not because they are not academically smart. It is not because they can't handle the coursework. What may happen is that parents at home need that income. And so if your mother and your father are suffering and you can provide some money to help alleviate their suffering, then you need to make money today, not tomorrow. And so you may actually leave school to do that. And so I would tell him, let's look at this holistically. I think there are some great proposals out there, but we really have to dig in deep and understand both the intended and unintended consequences of that. And then how do we go in and ensure that the proposals and the policies are doing what it is that we expect them to do. And that is not just, it's not politics and flashy as usual.
Yeah. Well, there's so many young people who will never go to college. You probably were on a path at some point in your life to never going to college, and I'm sure you would have found your way. But I just wonder sometimes if we're doing enough, if we're thinking enough about those who won't ever enter college and who have yet the ability to provide something meaningful to our society, who should be able to take care of themselves and their families. And there are jobs, of course, that they can do.
We have to create multiple pathways for people. And I say that college and an education was my pathway to success, right? It was my pathway out of poverty. My brother, on the other hand, he had a different pathway. He owns his own construction company. And so he loved working with his hands. He loved building things. Like, he had an eye for it, and he had a body for it. That's what he wanted to do. And so I often say that if I want to pass some policies, I call the founder of the organization I work for and say, I need you to introduce me to the governor, or I need you to introduce me to a state legislature. If I need some money, I call my brother, right? Who in school wasn't his thing. Right. Yeah. And so we need to have multiple pathways for people. And but the issue is that we don't want to deny people who want that opportunity to go to college, the opportunity to do that. But we also have to recognize that there are other ways to make a living. There are other ways to be successful. And on some level, we have to change the idea of college versus furthering your education, that those two things are
Yeah.
different. Because my brother did have to further his
Mm-hmm.
education to get his contractor's license. And so there was some school involved, but it wasn't
Right.
college. And we have to make sure that we're beginning to separate those two and have multiple paths for people.
Yes. And education is lifelong. Sam, I want to thank you for sharing with us on this first of a two-part interview. In our second interview, we're going to talk with you about what you learned as a grant seeker and how that informs you now as a grant maker. And we're also going to talk with you about what it means to be an African American male heading a major philanthropic institution. To learn more about Tipping Point Community and its work, go to www.tippingpoint.org. And I want to thank all of our listeners for checking in, and I hope you listen to our next episode with Sam. And if you want to find other interviews that we've had with all of our amazing guests, you can find us on all major podcast platforms.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. Send your comments and ideas to nona@thusmarket.com. That's nona@thusmarket.com. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.